It's a verb that we no longer use. We no longer use that as a verb, but it meant that. But I did discover another intriguing possible origin of the term foxing the brands. I'm sure many of you are familiar, particularly over in England, of the sport of fox hunting. Well, fox hunting takes place in the daytime, but there was this fad a couple hundred years ago where they tried fox hunting at night, and in order to see the foxes, they would tie lit firebrands onto the tails of the foxes. And so it possibly could come from that. That fad didn't last very long because people get upset that these lit brands would set the fields and forests on fire. So it didn't go very long, but that may be another origin of the term foxing the brands. But anyway, I just wanted to dedicate my program tonight to Bill Metzel. I did invite his family to come in. His wife, widow, wasn't sure if she could make it tonight or not. I don't think she came in. But anyway, I just wanted to do that quickly. So anyway, you might think this would be, a rather easy program because really what is charcoal, but there's a lot more to it than you would think. Well, anyway, let's first off, oops, sorry, I accidentally got myself here. Yeah, I think it's interesting that Dr. Joseph Rothrock, who was the first commissioner of forestry in Pennsylvania, we also consider him the father of forestry in Pennsylvania, that's what we call him, that he actually was quite interested in the charcoal process, and he wrote that, I quote, "I deem it worthwhile to illustrate a form of forest life, which at one time was quite common in this state, and which was necessary part of what was then the most important manufacturing interest of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, the production of charcoal iron." And he actually wrote some treatises on charcoal making, and even did some calculations about how charcoal making actually improved the forest. So anyway, what is charcoal? Well, it's a lightweight black carbon solid residue, and you produce it by intensely heating a carbonaceous material. Any plant or animal that has its carbon-based life can be made into charcoal. And you do this in an oxygen-starved atmosphere. Some people think that you do it in an oxygen-free, you wouldn't keep your fire going. So it's an oxygen-starved, you allow just enough oxygen to keep the fire going. We'll talk a little bit more about it in a moment. But anyway, in the process, we remove the water, oils, and resins of the wood and leave behind basically a carbon residue. Now, charcoal can be produced naturally by nature or by human activity. So it's both a natural product and a manufactured product. And any fire that you have, even a campfire, will produce charcoal as part of the combustion if you're, burning anything that's a carbonaceous material. It can be manufactured for cooking and industry. It's two big uses. In the process, we take the material, and for most people, when they think of charcoal, they think of wood charcoal. But there are other examples. The last couple of years, I read it over, and I think it was in either Pompeii or Herculaneum, they discovered a library of scrolls that had survived the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. And these survived because they were buried, creating an anaerobic environment, but the intense heat baked the papyrus rolls into charcoal, and therefore it preserved these, and they're able to use modern scanning techniques to read these and learn what was in this library without having to unroll them because they would crumble. But that's, again, a way of these scrolls, library scrolls were preserved, was they inadvertently returned to charcoal. Scientifically, the process is known as pyrolysis, which comes from the word fire and separating. In the process of charcoaling, the raw material actually fuels the process. And like for wood, you ignite the wood and then control the oxygen, and that fire itself literally turns itself to charcoal. We call this not just charcoal, but also coke and activated carbon. We call it destructive distillation, is again a scientific term for the process of converting the wood to charcoal. Well, anyway, the first part of what we really want are the solids. And these consist of mostly elemental carbon plus some trace minerals in the form of ash. These are things that don't burn or turn to ash in the process, and they become part of it. Now, products of the charcoaling process, of course, are your solids, your char plus ash, which is what we call charcoal. We also produce what's called condensable liquids. This is steam, oils, tar, and such that comes off in the process. And then you also have the non-condensable gases, such as carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, methane, and such like that. Common uses for charcoal. This is not a total comprehensive list, but is a list that shows you really the different uses for charcoal. Some of you may be surprised by some of this list. Now, some of these uses are historic uses, some are modern uses, some are both. Of course, iron production. Charcoal was the big fuel in iron production until the 19th century when coal and coke really took over for that. But even with the introduction of the mineral fuels, charcoal remained a fuel well into the 20th century because it produced a purer iron and steel than you could make with coal or coke. So it wasn't really until right before the Great Depression when the use of charcoal for iron making in America finally ceased. Of course, it's useful for cooking of food, and it's always outdoors. You never cook with charcoal indoors because it does have a high propensity of carbon monoxide. Art and craft mediums, such as charcoal pencils, pigments, charcoal drawing, things like that. So you can use it as an art. Purifying and filtering of water in the air. Very often, charcoal is used in the filtration process. It can purify water. Also, it's used in air filters. Odor eaters you put in your shoes use charcoal as the medium to take out odors. Toxin removal from the stomach in emergency. Very often somebody swallows medicines or certain poisons. They're given a solution of activated charcoal to drink, and then it will absorb those toxins. It doesn't remove every toxin, but there's quite a list of toxins that it can remove. One time people use it as toothpaste. As my friend Bill often said, charcoal powder is clean dirt. Even though it's black, it's clean. It's not dirty dirt, it's clean dirt. And people at one time, prior to toothpaste, used it to whiten their teeth. It can be used as an antacid, reducing heartburn, gas, and bloating. When I was doing my training burn, as one of the park visitors down there, he was complaining of having an upset stomach, and his wife was rummaging for some Tums or Rolaids, couldn't find any, and Teddy grabs a piece of charcoal from the basket and gives it to him, and he chews it, and of course his wife freaks out. Goes back a few minutes later, said it worked. So it can be used as an antacid. It's a good soil additive. It improves the water and hold capacity of soil, reduces mold growth. In this instance, today, the modern term for adding charcoal to soil is known as biochar. In cosmetics, it absorbs impurities and detoxifies the skin. Yeah, a lot of cosmetics contain charcoal powder. Removes odors in cars or the fridge. My mother liked it better than putting baking soda in the fridge. I used to give her some charcoal. She'd set it in the dish in the refrigerator, and it would do much the same thing as putting a box of baking soda. And of course, gunpowder. It's useful for that. So these are just some of the many uses for charcoal. One more, the refining of sugar. How many of you know that charcoal was used in the refining of sugar? And not just wood charcoal. In the past, can you imagine working on these where they would do the refining of sugar down in the Caribbean, and ships would come up and they go in the harbor, and all the bones from the butcher shops they would put on the ships and take them down. Can you imagine the stench from all the rotting meat on these animal bones? Well, they take it down there and they would charcoal the bones and made it what's called bone black. And then they would use that in the refining of sugar. The condensable liquids. And the liquid, kind of when it comes off, the first constituent we call it pyroligneous acid from fire and wood. Older names for this substance was known as wood vinegar or wood acid. And by 10% volume, these are the principal wood chemicals that are extracted from pyroligneous acid: acetic acid, acetate of lime, acetone, and methanol. You also have the water-soluble components, such as steam and liquid smoke. How many of you use liquid smoke in cooking? This is where it comes from. It's separated from the pyroligneous acid of charcoal making. Well, just a brief on the wood chemical industry of Pennsylvania. There's a plant that was up in one of the northern tier, and I have a piece from the Logging Railroad era book showing you all the different wood chemical plants are up in north central Pennsylvania. There were over 70 of them, starting about the 1850s and into the 1950s, but the heyday was mostly the 1890s and 1940s, where they would make wood chemicals. Mostly it was in north central Pennsylvania. McKean County was the center of the industry, and they would use a lot of the scrap wood from the lumber mills that were up in that area. That was really the area where they stripped the northern forest. It became what's known as the Pennsylvania Desert. And they would use special ovens that would capture those gases and such from the charcoal in retort ovens. And they would condense it, look kind of like a big still, like a moonshine still. They would condense the gases and then they would separate it. There's one story that I remember running across during during Prohibition. There were some manufacturers, as a byproduct of what they made, ended up making ethanol or alcohol that could be drank. Well, the government required them to denature it by mixing it with methanol, which is a poisonous form of alcohol, so people couldn't drink it. But there was too much money to be made in the black market from selling this liquor as bootleg. So these companies would buy rail cars of methanol and simply dump them when the inspectors weren't around. Well, there's a story about one tank car that got back to the wood chemical company. The company forgot to dump it. It was still full. And so they contacted the manufacturer and said, what do you want to do with this? You send it back. They said, I'll just ship it to us again and charge us for it. So they paid twice for the same load of methanol. The wood chemicals, just a brief on these. The acetic acid, of course, has industrial uses, but it's also used as a food additive in preserving food and pickling. Vinegar, you buy in the store, is actually about 4% acetic acid. However, it's not derived from charcoaling in the form of vinegar. It's found other way, but it's the same substance. Acetate of lime or calcium acetate controls blood pressure and kidney dialysis. It can stabilize and improve the quality of food as an additive. Acetone or propanone, paint remover, plastics and textile manufacture, cosmetics such as nail polish remover. And of course, methanol is an alternate fuel, a pesticide, and a solvent. And of course, we come to liquid smoke. This is used to flavor meats and vegetables. It imparts a smoke flavor because of what is taken out of the pyroligneous acid is what carries the flavor of smoking. Can use as a substitute for actually smoking of meats. When I learned about this a few years ago, I actually started using liquid smoke for cooking, and I actually, like say, if I just make hamburgers in a skillet or something like that, I add a little bit of liquid smoke to it. It really makes them good. As a product, it was first marketed in 1895, and of course, it was condensed out of the wood smoke in a retort oven. It can carry the flavors depending on the source wood, like you have hickory, cherry, mesquite. You can have different flavors of liquid smoke for your meats. The non-condensable gases, list them again here, basically carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, methane, and the particulate matter, which is your solids that go out as a fine dust. These were traditionally just off-gassed into the atmosphere. However, today they're recaptured in retort ovens, and these gases are flammable. It's a low volatile flammability, and it can be used to fuel the retort ovens. And so often that's what they use in order to make modern charcoal in these ovens, is these off gases. Now, there's three basic types of charcoal. The one that I deal with most is called lump charcoal. You can buy it. Certain brands do make it. Kingsford does not make it, for instance, but other companies do make lump charcoal. If you look at it, it's simply natural charcoal. It has no additives to it. It burns hot with a near smokeless blue flame. It doesn't impart flavor to the meat or whatever you're cooking, but it does provide a nice heat. Of course, most people are familiar with charcoal briquettes, which are manufactured from wood byproducts. These have additives in it. I'll talk more about this in a moment. And of course, activated charcoal or activated carbon. This is manufactured at a little higher temperature and then exposed to various gases depending on what it's being used for to activate it, which increases the absorption of the charcoal. Most of this product is used in medicinal uses or in the filtration of air, water, fish tanks, things like that. That's where you get your activated charcoal. Briquettes. So are charcoal briquettes actually charcoal? Well, you can say not exactly. And the reason is that charcoal briquettes are created specifically now for outdoor cooking. And depending on which brand you buy, they vary by brand. These are the different additives that can be put into them, such as, in addition to your wood charcoal, you can have coal, limestone ash, starch, borax, sodium nitrate, sawdust, wax, chaff. Sometimes they'll put some flavoring, liquid smoke flavoring in them, like mesquite or something like that. But depending on the brand, they'll have a variety of these additives. Briquettes were actually patented in 1895 as a lump of fuel. He never thought of using them in a barbecue grill outside. He created it for cook stoves. They were still, most people still cook with wood fuel in their stoves in their house. It never really caught on for that use, and there was no national distribution, like no national brand of it. It was locally produced and sold. So anyway, the charcoal briquette that we know of today was developed and marketed by whom? And there's a little hint in the title. Yep, Henry Ford. He was responsible for the modern charcoal briquette. He was bothered by all the wood scraps from automaking, so he built a plant to turn these scraps into wood chemicals. He needed the wood chemicals for his car making, and then used the residual charcoal as a cooking fuel. And marketed starting in 1923, it was actually branded Ford Charcoal. And you bought it at Ford dealerships. Well, eventually, he developed a camping stove to go with these, and sold the camping stove as well. And in 1947, the company was renamed for Ford's cousin-in-law, Edward L. Kingsford. So this is the origin of Kingsford charcoal. It started out as Ford charcoal. In geology, charcoal has a lot of uses. Of course, it naturally occurs in the geologic record. Is usually charcoalified plants, what they call or term fossil charcoal. It does last a long time in the environment. It's relatively inert and easily preserved. It's also very important in the study of deep time, not by actually dating the charcoal, but it does tell them a bit about the environmental conditions of the era. Of course, it's usually found in sedimentary deposits, and it occurs anywhere from large pieces to microscopic particles. And historically, in the geologic record, wildfires and volcanic activity would be the source of ignition to make charcoal. The oldest evidence of a wildfire in the geologic record is during the early Silurian, roughly 300 or 430 million years ago. And this suggests that the atmosphere was at least 16% oxygen at the time. Today, it's 21% of our atmosphere is oxygen. Laboratory experiments have shown that you need at least 16% to support a wildfire, a natural wildfire. So that's where they get that 16%. So it gives them an idea. They actually think it was higher than that, and even a little bit higher than what it is today at the time of this oldest evidence. But they found out that the threshold was at least 16%. And to the right are two images of fossil charcoal. Well, in archaeology, charcoal is also very useful. Of course, it's evidence of human use of fire in the past, useful for absolute dating of sites. If you're not familiar with archaeology, there's two basic forms of dating. There's absolute dating and relative dating. Absolute dating is where you are able to peg a date or a range of dates based on scientific testing of either the artifact or the substrate in which the artifact is found, like the soil or other things around it. Relative dating is simply putting things in order. Like, for instance, a Model T Ford is older than a 1950s car with, the tail fins versus a modern car. And so relative dating just puts it in a date order, but doesn't give it a date. So this is useful. And radiocarbon dating is the method. There are other forms of or other dating techniques for absolute dating in the archaeological and geologic record. Radiocarbon is perhaps the most well-known publicly. And it's good for maybe 50 to 60,000 years. Most geologists don't use radiocarbon because of that short time period. It's good for human past, but when you're going back millions of years of geologic record, it's not useful for dating. Many archaeologists believe charcoal was first made specifically by humans soon after they learned how to control fire, because again, charcoal is naturally made in a fire. Around 3000 BC, the charcoal is found to be used for pigment in cave drawings. About 4000 BC, humans started using charcoal for the smelting of various metals, not just iron, but also copper, bronze, and other metals. 1500 BC, the first recorded medicinal use of charcoal. 400 BC, that the Phoenicians discovered its property of purifying water. On their ships, they would charcoal the inside of water storage barrels, and they found that it kept the water safe to drink. So as a fuel, until 1839 in America, all ironworks used charcoal in Pennsylvania. The date may be a little bit different in other states, but in Pennsylvania at least, 1839 was the first successful attempts to make iron using a fuel other than charcoal. There were a few experimentals in the early 1830s, but this is the first time it was used on industrial scale. After that, anthracite fuel came in. A little bit of bituminous, but bituminous coal had too much sulfur in it, and it affected the quality of the iron. It wasn't until they started converting bituminous coal to coke in western Pennsylvania that coke basically supplanted bituminous coal and anthracite. Today, many furnaces use natural gas or electricity. Typical charcoal furnace, like Greenwood furnace, which is depicted here, these are from late 1700s to 1900. Furnaces were fueled with coal or coke were much larger than Greenwood. Example, Carey furnaces near Pittsburgh typically could make 1,200 tons per day, which is about what Greenwood made in a year. That gives you the scale difference. So prior to the furnace, we know that the valley floor had been timbered. We know there was a sawmill there. Most of it, though, was still forested and such. So just to give you a little example of charcoal, there was a lot of wood still around to be made into charcoal. And this is important because for a charcoal furnace like Greenwood, for each ton of iron produced required 150 to 200 bushels of charcoal. That equates to 1.5 to 2 tons by weight. The standard measure of charcoal for iron making was 20 pounds to the bushel, or 100 bushels to the ton. Then it took about 1.5 to 3 tons of iron ore, 3/4 to 1 ton of limestone. And Greenwood made 4 to 5 tons of iron per day, 1,200, maybe a little bit later on, about 1,800 tons per year. Remember I said 1,900 furnaces in Pittsburgh can make that same amount a day. Well, wood was measured in a cord, and that's how they were tallied for payment for the wood choppers. And a cord of wood is a pile 4 feet by 4 feet by 8 feet, 128 cubic feet. The standard measure for this at the time was 4-foot lengths, and that was known as a billet. The wood would be cut by the wood choppers, and typically at a furnace, there would be a whole army. Roughly in 1872 at Greenwood, about half the workers were wood choppers. And that's because there were the enormous quantity. Now, each man, it's recorded, could cut between 2.5 and 4 cords per day. I have people that told me in programming with a chainsaw they couldn't do that much wood in a day. I said, well, they were splitting it down to 4-foot length, so they weren't cutting it as small. Typically, through much of the later half of the 19th century, they were paid 30 cents a cord, about 75 cents a day. Compare that to a laborer at the furnace who made $1 a day. So they were a little less paid. They worked more, they could earn a little bit more. But per day, a furnace, again, making 4 to 5 tons, needed about 35 to 40 cords. And it yielded about 800 to 1,000 bushels of charcoal, or 8 to 10 tons. So that's per day. Per year, a furnace typically used about 5,000 cords of wood, which equals a pile 4 feet high, 4 feet wide, by 7.5 miles long. That would be every year. That amount of trees, 35 to 40 cords, is the yield of 1 acre of forest every day. So every day Greenwood operating, it would consume on the stump 1 acre of forest. Of course, you can imagine that intensity of cutting. This is an actual image from Greenwood Furnace showing the cord measures up on the hillside. Look, there isn't much left standing. So a furnace would cut roughly 300 acres a year. Now, it's a little less than 365 days because they had to shut the furnace down every year to do some annual routine maintenance on it, like relining it and such. So we take that 300 acres by 70 years, and we add 14 years for the time when 2 furnaces operated there. So we estimate, based on 84 years of operation, the amounts to 25,200 acres of forest were cut, sometimes more than once, to fuel the furnace. But there's even more to this. We know that at Greenwood Furnace, they also produce charcoal for the company in Burnham, where I live. Today, that company is known as Standard Steel, but in the past, they also had a furnace here and forges, which they also use charcoal. Now, they did make some of their charcoal more locally here, but we do know that some was made at Greenwood Furnace and shipped directly over there to supplement what they were making here. So adding to that, we estimate that about 100,000 acres of forest were charcoaled in the area Greenwood Furnace over a 70-year period. That's 100,000 acres spread over about 60,000 acres that they owned. So most of it they cut at least twice, sometimes 3 times. So now, how do we make the charcoal? Well, this is the process that was done historically. I have a mix here of modern pictures and also some historic pictures. The first thing you need is a hearth. This would be a level flat area. This is a scale hearth that we built at Greenwood Furnace to do the demonstrations. This hearth is only maybe about 20 to 25 feet in diameter. The regular hearths were anywhere from about 40 to 60 feet in diameter. You start by setting the chimney in the middle of it. Now, if you ever built a log cabin fire, you know you take two sticks and stack them like a log cabin. However, in charcoal making, it's more stable to do a three-sided chimney rather than a four-sided chimney. Once we start building it, then we stack the billets vertically. Now here, the billets are in scale. They're probably about 1.5 feet long, not 4 feet long. And we start putting it together by stacking around the chimney. Now, this pit won't get much higher than this. Again, we were doing it in scale for demonstration purposes. But this is an image taken at the Mont Alto State Forest Academy in 1907. Yes, the early foresters in the State Forest School learned how to make charcoal. In the background, you can see a couple of the old colliers from Mont Alto Furnace, and the students are in the foreground. These pieces of wood here are true 4 feet long. And you can see this pile starting to get about 10 feet tall. They would take a log ladder like this and notch it to get up onto the top of the pit. Oops, sorry, I clicked too much. So this is a photograph from Greenwood Furnace showing a pit right before the next process of leafing and dusting. And again, each one of those pieces of wood in this picture are 4 feet long. You notice in the foreground, in addition to some bigger logs, there's also some smaller pieces. To make the best charcoal, you want as little airspace as possible in the pit. So they would use the smaller stuff, they call it lapwood. And they would fill in the spaces between the bigger pieces to reduce that amount of airspace within the pit. Well, the next thing you do is cover it with a layer of leaves and then a layer of dirt. This is leafing and dusting our pit. There's a historic picture I found on the internet. They were using, I think, plant material rather than leaves here, but it's the same effect. Again, here is we're ready to light it off. And what you do in charcoal making, you don't light it at the bottom, you light it at the top. Here we're dropping hot coals into the top of the chimney. The reason for that is you don't want the carbon to be consumed as it's being burned in the charcoal. So by putting the fire at the top and putting vents at the bottom and controlling the amount of oxygen that goes in, amount of air, the fire consumes the oxygen at the fire line and leaves the carbon behind it. And that's why we light it at the top. Now, once the pit is lit, you reseal it, and then it's tended 24/7 for 10 to 14 days in real life. This pit here we would do in 24 hours. We would do it overnight. It was about 1/4 of a cord of wood is what we did. During the time, it has to be tended. You have to check because as it charcoals, it shrinks because you're removing material, the charcoal will shrink. In the end, the charcoal loses about half its volume and about 90% of its weight. And of course, you have to tend the pit at night. In the daytime, you watch the color of the smoke. That tells you what's going on inside. You can't see that at night, so you look for the eyes of the fire. Here is a pit, a Greenwood furnace. You see it's much larger than our pit. There's no one here for scale, but here is another pit to give you a bit more of the scale. Now, this must be pretty close to being finished. Yes, the guy up on top, it was known as jumping the pit. They would get up there and they stomp on it because as it charcoals, you get voids, and they tried to keep that sealed so they would stomp on it. And hopefully they didn't break through into it, but it did occasionally happen. And the guy on the horse would be the charcoal boss, was coming around to check to see and to measure charcoal for payment. When the pit comes to foot or comes to the bottom, we seal it off and let the fire go out by totally letting it consume the oxygen inside. It's called damping off. And then it's raked out. In Here's a historic picture I found on the internet of raking out charcoal. And then it would ship it to the furnace. This is a picture from Greenwood Furnace. It's the oldest picture we have of the furnace operation. I date this picture to around 1870. The furnaces are in the background. It's the only picture we have that's taken during the time when both Greenwood furnaces were in operation. That was between 1864 and 1882. All the other pictures we have only depict stack number 2, but this is the time of stack number 1. And of course, the end of the coaling season, it was party time. Yeah, we partied a little bit here, but the real colliers, they would celebrate by getting some hard cider, getting drunk, and burning their collier huts down. Of course, we remember we said we call that the colliers. They were paid 2 cents a bushel, which doesn't sound like a lot, but they were actually the 5th highest paid worker at the furnace, and their 2 cents a bushel for a good collier equaled $1.50 a day. Remember, half again as much as a regular laborer there. And if you look at the faces of these guys, one thing about charcoal, because the oils and stuff of the wood go off in the smoke, you get it on you and in your lungs. And you get the charcoal powder in it, and it kind of works its way down in the pores of your skin. And the more charcoal you make over the years, the blacker you become from it. You, in essence, become tattooed with charcoal. And they used to say a clean collier was a green collier. So they measured their experience by how dirty they were. They also joked that the only time they bathed was when it rained. I can tell you, just doing it for a weekend, even just that little bit, that oil and stuff sticks on your skin for several days. You can smell it for several days. This is a early hut. This is actually a staged photograph. Rothrock, when he wrote his treatise on charcoal making, wanted a picture of a hut and couldn't find one, so he knew some old charcoal makers, so he had to go out and build a hut, and they posed in front of it to take this picture to show what these huts would look like. Now, these were earthen huts. They had a stone side on it where they had the cook stove. Mostly the cook stove, they had something like sow belly and beans in it, which is basically a type of bean soup with fat in it. They took some meal out, and when they were done, they simply threw more beans and more sow belly in it. Now, these are recipes actually come to us from the colliers of Greenwood. We interviewed some families, and this is what they told us, the sow belly and beans. They also told us about this cabin fuss and potatoes. I've actually made both of these for demonstrations in the park. Cabin fuss and potatoes, basically you take bacon and you fry it up in a pan, leave the grease in it, and then you add thin sliced potatoes and onions and fry it all till it's all cooked and brown. That's cabin fuss and potatoes. With coffee, you simply put the, keep clicking on it. You can see the coffee pot here. You simply boil the water, and then you threw your grounds in and let it boil. And then when you're done, you cracked a couple eggs in it, and the eggs would fry in the coffee, and they would fry the coffee grounds into the egg, and then you threw the egg away, and you had your coffee for your grounds. They also liked hard cider, which is apple cider, which has become alcoholic. It ferments into an alcoholic thing, so they call that hard cider. This is an actual photo of colliers from Greenwood Furnace. It came from one of the families here. In the background, it shows you, in later years, they built slabwood cabins, and this is one of the slabwood cabins. This photograph needed a bit of restoration to it. The gentleman right here is, again, probably the charcoal boss. If you look up here, the kid up on the horse has a dog in his lap. You can also see a sled for transporting the wood right here. And to kind of end this here, there's a lot of terms that were used by the charcoal makers. Jerry did send it around, a brochure that I created. On the back side of that brochure, on the back page, these are listed, so you don't have to kind of write them down, but you can see them later on. These are all terms that were specific to charcoal making. And there's quite a bit of them, and I know the lettering's a little small, but I tried to squeeze them all on that one page. And so often when we do the charcoal demonstrations, we use these terms and explain them to the audience so they know. Remember at night, I didn't talk about it too much, but instead of seeing the smoke, you go walk around, it's totally dark around the pit. And if it burns through the covering, you can see the orange glow of the fire inside. And we call that the eyes of the fire. And that's what you look for at night. And then you take some leaves and dirt and poke in there to seal it up. But again, as I said, these are all different terms of the charcoaling process. Okay, I'll open it up now to any questions you have.
Put your questions in the chat for Paul. Fine program.
If you ever want to see it, just look in state parks. I did one earlier this summer, Greenwood, the Fall Festival at Pine Grove Furnace down in Jerry's neck of the woods. They usually do one with their fall festival. I'm no longer involved with that one, but I trained the friends group down there how to do it. Somebody asked about the leaves. The leaves are used to create the oxygen-starved atmosphere. Because the leaves overlap, they kind of seal it, and then the dirt is used, A, to keep the leaves from blowing off in the wind, but also to compress the leaves to get the air out from between them as much as possible. If you ever took a campfire and you put a pile of leaves on, you know it suddenly just starts smoking. You're in essence there trying to you end up making charcoal underneath it, basically. Let's see. Did colliers get lung issues equal to the miners? Well, this is an interesting thing about charcoal making. I do remember running across information in Rothrock, although we think of him as a forester and a botanist, he was actually a medical doctor, as was his father. And the thought is that he would go out to treat people who had tuberculosis or consumption. It was a known treatment in the 19th century. People with those diseases, you take them out and live with the charcoal makers for a while. In that acrid smoke environment, they seemed to be cured. By the time medical science would advance enough to be able to start testing it, charcoal making was on its way out, new treatments were coming in, so it was never investigated. But I remember over the years at Greenwood running into medical doctors who were respiratory specialists talking about in med school this line of reasoning that there might have been something about charcoal making. It was seen to be understood at the time too that charcoal makers did not get their diseases like the general population. Some thought was they were out in more of a pure air in the forest versus the more polluted cities. But if that was the case, why did lumbermen who were out in those similar environments but without the smoke get at the same rate as the general population? So that's kind of unanswered, although there is some literature on that there may have been some therapeutic benefit to charcoal making for the colliers and such. Let me see here once. Totally forested. While charcoal making was one of the industries that deforested, lumber was a big one. Mine props for coal mining. I can tell you, and this again is based on literature from the 19th century, that the only industry that utilized the forest in the 19th century that actually encouraged the regrowth of those forests was the charcoal iron industry. Lumber companies would cut and run. The mine props for coal mines would cut and run. You couldn't run with a stone stack. So there is this literature that the forest conservation movement, in some respects, not totally, but partially came out of the charcoal iron industry because they did things to allow the forest to regrow. And they did this at a time when there's no trained foresters or even the science of forestry to help them. But they did understand that particularly the hardwoods would grow back what we call a copic forest, mostly from root sprouts and stump sprouts from the hardwoods that were cut. And the other thing too is if you germinate a forest from seeds, it takes more than 100 years to get a mature forest. A copic forest can do that in 20 to 30 years. So they could actually go back and recut the same land on roughly a 30-year rotation. And Rothrock, remember I said he did a lot. He calculated on a regrowth land, a copic land, you could reasonably infer 1 cord per year of growth. So like say if you let that acre grow for 30 years, you should be able to yield at least 30 cords off that acre. So it was 1 cord per acre per year of growth. So yeah, between charcoal making, lumber companies and everything, all the other uses, yeah, Pennsylvania was pretty much deforested. Maybe if Jerry wants me to sometime, I'll do a program on the lumber industry of Pennsylvania, if you're interested in that. But many people don't realize this, but Pennsylvania still holds the record for the longest, steadiest output of timber production in the history of the country. And Williamsport, Pennsylvania is the only city in the world to ever hold the title lumber capital of the world. They could cut, at Williamsport alone, almost 2 billion board feet of timber per year. That's a lot of timber. Let me see. Yeah, charcoal making, talking to foresters, they have told me that lands cut for charcoal making seem to grow better than lands cut for lumber. Because in charcoal making, remember I said they used the smaller wood to fill the spaces. Because they took everything. They literally clear cut. Where lumber companies generally would do a diameter limit cut. Anything under a certain size isn't worth their time to cut it. They just left it. And I know, again, talking with modern foresters and forestry professors at Penn State, they say the reason is that if you they say actually clear cutting is one of the best ways to get a forest in the next generation, but it's got a bad rep from the environmental people. But if you want the best regrowth, that is actually the best way to go. But what they recommend is what they call a shelter wood cut. Most times, like say you own a woodlot and you want to earn some money for it, you call in a lumber guy, say ABC Lumber Company. He's going to come in and say, look, he says, we'll take out every tree 6 inches in diameter or larger. You'll get your money for that. And then all these other smaller trees, which are quote unquote younger, then they'll grow and you'll have another forest again. The problem is in Pennsylvania, likely that forest is an even age forest, which means a tree that's 12 inches in diameter is the same age as one that's 3 inches diameter. So what he does is he takes out the big stuff and leaves you with the small stuff that doesn't grow any bigger or very much. So you end up with nothing in the next generation, or very little. What they recommend as service foresters is that you take everything out under a certain diameter, like say cut everything out under 6 inches, let those trees for 5 years to drop their seeds, start a new regrowth, and then take the big trees out, and then you have a new forest based on seeds from the healthiest, most vibrant trees in that woodlot, instead of the ones that are more stunted in growth. So yeah, there is benefit to clear cutting, but I said today it's kind of got a bad reputation. Let's see. Yeah, the Iceman. Let's see. Yes, 50 tattoos made with charcoal. Yeah. Yeah, there are some about a couple dozen old growth forest areas in Pennsylvania. I think it's about 7% of Pennsylvania's forests are old growth, is what remains standing. Now, Pennsylvania was literally clear cut from one end of the state to the other.
There was an earlier question about why do you use a layer of leaves and then dirt on top of that?
Well, the leaves are used to seal the pit because leaves will interlace, and then you put the dirt on partially to hold the leaves in place so they don't blow off in the wind, but also it compresses the air out of them, and it makes a very effective seal, enough that it basically doesn't allow oxygen, or statistically almost no oxygen, through the interlayers of the leaves. That's why you use the leaves on it. Sod, soot, or not sod, but sorghum, not sorghum, sphagnum moss, other things in different areas of the world they would use to make that seal. But by compressing it, you compress the air out of it. And leaves actually make a good insulator like that. It's like in the wintertime, you wear layers of clothing. The less air between them, you want a little bit, but the less air, it kind of creates an insulation layer. And that's kind of what the leaves do. It creates an insulation and a seal. And then the dirt helps hold it together. And I will tell you, too, that they actually like the term dust, which is soil mixed with charcoal powder. The colliers preferred pit or hearths that were used over and over again because the dust got better with each burning. When they would end cutting and charcoaling in an area, they would level the dust over the pit, over the hearth, and leave it there. When they come back 30 years later, the first thing they would do is recover all that, pull it to the side, and then reuse it. And they would actually go reuse the old hearths because this dust it actually knitted together and held better than simply dirt or soil. So they actually preferred what they call dust.
All right. Paul, do you have that link for the video you were trying to talk about? Or
I will send that to Jerry. I was going to show a video, but it's just because it's after 8 o'clock. It's about a 20-minute video. I don't want to take up too much of your time. Back in 2015, Bill Metzel, one of the forest people at Penn State, Dr. Sandy Smith, and I did a 3-day charcoal burn at the Penn State's Ag Progress Days. It takes place in August. It's usually a big workshop convention out at the Rock Springs Research Farms outside of State College. It's over Pennsylvania Furnace. But they have 3 days. They show farming techniques, all kinds of things related to agriculture and farming. And over the years, I've done some programming with them. That year, back in the woods, we created a hearth and built about two, I think maybe 3-cord pit, and took 3 days to burn it to demonstrate it. A couple of years ago, we actually took a charcoal wagon over to Greenwood Furnace, as far as I know, has the only surviving charcoal wagon from the furnace operations. Give me a second here, and I will show you. But I have to put it up. I didn't get a chance. I had to restart my computer. So what I'll do is I'll create a Dropbox link in my Dropbox for you. If anybody wants, is about a 20-minute video with Bill, Sandy, and I interpreting charcoal making at the pit. And
you send it on down. I'll send it out to everybody.
Yeah, and then if you want to look at it, you can. I'll send a couple other links too that I have for. About to give a second here. There is another video up there too. I'll send a couple links along with that. Trying to come up with quickly. But any more questions while I'm...
Another great program, yes, indeed. I know in South Mountain within York Adams, Cumberland County, a professor, I believe, at Shippensburg counted by LIDAR mapping about 2,100 charcoal terraces in South Mountain, pretty much all centered around Pine Grove Furnace.
Well, we several years ago, these two gentlemen from the U.S. Department of Energy came to the park, and they were scouting out these things, seeing in the LIDAR images, there were charcoal hearths. And I worked with them, gave them a lot of historical background, and they were doing a presentation at this energy conference. And even though I didn't attend to it, they gave me co-author credit on their display for that.
Okay.
But I'm going to share the screen here. This is the charcoal wagon at Greenwood Furnace. This is an actual wagon built and used at Greenwood Furnace. As far as I know, it's the only surviving charcoal wagon from a furnace. To give you a little idea, the back wheel here is 5 foot diameter. The fronts are 4. The bed is 20 feet long and stands about just under 10 feet in height. It can haul 300 bushels or 3 tons of charcoal in a single load. It would take 3 to 4 wagon loads every day to feed the furnace. This was a project, we got it back. It was when the furnace closed, there was an auction. They sold them off. Most of them went to an ironworks down in Union County. This one wagon, though, was bought by a local farmer and went down to a farm a few miles down the valley and stayed there for the next 70 years. And then, 80 years. And then in the mid 80s, when the park was starting to put the history together, the family donated it back. But all that remained of the original wagon was basically what you see, the orange underneath, the running gear of it. And it was fixed up at the time. They didn't have a lot of information. They did it incorrectly. But a few years ago, it was starting to get rot damage again because it had been displayed outside for many years before we moved it inside. So I led a project with our friends group. It took us 3.5 years, and we totally restored it. We broke it down to parts. The wheels were restored down in Lancaster County, and an Amish or Mennonite-owned coach works that works on wagon wheels. So they did that. The rest of it we did pretty much in-house. The bed was built over in Allensville. The finishes on it, if you want to know, the orange is milk paint, which was matched to the original color we found underneath on the axles. The iron was all heated and oiled like you oil a cast iron skillet. Season a skillet, it's not painted, it's oiled as they would have done historically. The bed is finished with walnut stain made from black walnut husks from American black walnut, and then finished with a mix of turpentine and linseed oil, which again is a historic finish. One of my goals of this was to restore it as historically accurate as possible. And so there's no one standing here in this, but let me see if I can come up with another picture here for you. This one will give you a little bit better sense of the scale. This is inside the building. Give me a second here to share the screen again. And here you go. This is displayed inside the building. Gives you a little bit more of a sense of the size of the wagon. As I said again, the rear wheels are 5 feet tall. So again, gives you kind of an idea. The plank you see right here was the loading plank. They would put the feed here up on the wheel hubs, and they would measure it in bushel baskets and load it. Somebody would be up here in the top. And then to unload it, they would go around to the back of the wagon. The floorboards in this were made removable. They take old horseshoes and nail them on, bring the front team around, they pull the floorboards out and allow the charcoal to dump to the ground. That's how they unloaded it. Kind of like the ancestor of the modern walking floor in some tractor trailer trucks.
How much would that weigh, Paul?
Well, the wagons historically were said to weigh about 4 tons empty. And I can tell you this little secret too. If you want to know the live load capacity of a wagon, measure the width of the tire treads. It's 1 inch per ton of live load. These are 3.5-inch tires. So that means this wagon has a live load capacity or cargo capacity of 3.5 tons.
Huh. And how many horses would take it?
This would take 6.
6, wow.
Here, I'll show you a couple other. Let's see here. Let's bring up a couple good. Now, these are from 1930, but here would be a typical team. They recreated this in 1930. By the way, that's the same wagon that I just showed you from that farm. They brought it up in 1930 and fixed it up. But this shows you what a typical charcoal team would have looked like at the time. And here's a couple to give you a little bit of sense of scale. there's a better view of that one.
Yeah, we're not seeing that one.
Oh, we're not? I guess my screen share went off. Hold on. Yeah, there you go.
Huh.
Now, the gentleman right here was an actual Teamster at Greenwood Furnace. His name was George Griffin. He was kind of like the official historian of Greenwood Furnace after it closed. He did a lot to compile history and photographs and such to preserve the history of Greenwood Furnace before he passed away. So a lot of what we have today of the furnace back in its day comes from George Griffith.
Okay. We need to move on here.
Yep.
Thanks for a wonderful again program. Hey, Melanie, Tracy.
I'm here.
I was looking for you in that Mount Alto picture, but then I realized it was 1907.
Oh yeah, no, I loved the Mont Alto parts. That's close to home. I was a Mont Alto student. I started in forestry, finished in something similar, but I was actually coincidentally at Mont Alto this past Saturday as they had their 120th anniversary for forestry at the school.
Oh.
It was a big deal. They had an entire event for it, an all-day thing. We took a hike up to Pulpit Rock, where Roth Rock has his famous picture of his dog and his rifle on top of this rock formation there looking over South Mountain. Took a walk up there. We tested dendrology skills, wood ID skills, arborist skills, and ended the afternoon with some woodsman's team skills, some timber sports.
Wow.
I participated in college with big cross-cut saws that are very, historical to the times and everything. And so it was a blast. So this presentation kind of hit close to home for me.
Were you out there chopping wood Saturday?
I was.
There you go. So what can we expect in our next program, October 3rd? What are you gonna talk about yourself?
So maybe I just gave some of it away.
Oh, okay. We'll keep them in suspense.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
So Melanie, did you have to take your own horse to Mont Alto?
Unfortunately, that was not on my back to school list. I did not have to bring a rifle and my own horse when I attended, but past students did.
Yes.
I missed the cut on that one.
And you also had to build their own dorm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's
Conklin
Hall. The students in the daytime took class, and in the night built the dorm.
They did. It's called Conklin. It's
Conklin Hall. Yep.
Still there, but it's used for administration. It's not used for dormitories anymore, but that's okay.
Yeah. All right. Well, okay. Yep. October 3rd, we'll be back to see you. And with that special get to know us program sort of deal. And as always, you can watch any Zoom Rock Room that we've done on jonesgeo.com under Zoom Rock Room. All the videos are there. If you want to look at them again during the week, or if you miss it, or if you want to share it with your friends, please do that. We're always looking for new people. So thank Paul Fagley again for the wonderful program.
Yes, thank you, Paul.
And you wanna sign us off tonight, Mel?
I sure can. Again, thank you, Paul, for your donating your time with us this evening, sharing something that is very close to home for some of us, like I said, for me personally. And we will see you all very shortly in October. Fall is approaching. Please take advantage of the amazing weather that we've been having. It has been beautiful. I highly advise taking a walk outside sometime, guys, for sure. But thank you for joining us, and we will see you next time.
See you, everybody.
Bye-bye.